We're so glad that you're here. We are still trying to figure out pandemic programming. You can get 40 people registering for a program and a third of that shows up. But I'm so glad to see every one of you who shows up because you all are eager to be here. So we look forward to the day when we are able to fill the room again with people. Speaking of, while he's getting ready, I hope you all will bring any young people you know. On Saturday, we're having our first ever Children's Book Festival here at the Athenaeum. We're very excited. From 10 to 3, we're really focusing on kids who are ages like 9 to 14 in reader's age, but if they have younger siblings, we have some amazing authors coming to do workshops and author readings. There'll be bookstores and a comic book store here doing sales. Some of the workshops will be like make your own comic, make a collage, make your own book. And these are some really amazing authors who are coming from Philadelphia, from New York City. So it should be a really fun time. So if you have neighbors, grandkids, kids, you yourself love kids' books, come, please. We're looking forward to a great time. So welcome to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. Peggy, were you going to say something? No, we will not. We will not. I think it might be a little crazy trying to manage that, but we will be masked. Yes, but we will be requiring masks for the event. So we're so thrilled that you all are here, and it's good I was a little slower because people have been coming in. We're great to have you here. I'm Beth Hessel, the Executive Director of the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. We are so delighted to have every single one of you here with us this evening. We are a community of people who love to read, who love education and learning for ourselves and for others. We love our city and the history of our city and the people in our city. And all of that really comes together in tonight's program. So I'm glad that we are all here for it. I am excited for our guest speaker, and I'm going to introduce her in a moment, but I want to ask, are any of you products of Germantown High School? We have one. One, wow. Hopefully some of the people will be watching this later will be graduates of Germantown High School. So we're glad to have Diane Rossheim here representing Germantown High tonight. If you are a brand new visitor to the Athenaeum and this is your first time here, a special welcome to you. And we want to let everybody know that we are an open membership organization. We are supported by our members, but we are open to more members. And if you appreciate what you experience here, you think this is an amazing place you'd love to come and hang out at, please see me, see Bruce in the back, see Tess downstairs, go online, and find out about becoming a member, because we'd love to have you a part of the Athenaeum. Our speaker tonight is Erika Kitzmiller. She is a product of Wellesley College and the University of Pennsylvania, and she is a term assistant professor in education at Barnard College. She's an historian of race, inequality, and education whose scholarship examines the historical process and current reform efforts that have contributed to inequality today. In addition to teaching at Barnard, she's a research affiliate with the Institute for Urban and Minority Education at Teachers College, Columbia University. She's a very busy woman. I asked her if she needed some water. She says, I take it with me, I'm a teacher. I know I always need to have it handy. Her scholarship has been published in the Harvard Educational Review and Teachers College Record, as well as in Dissent, the Hetchinger Report, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and Reuters. Her work has also received funding from Harvard University, the National Academy of Education, the National Science Foundation, the Russell Sage Foundation, and the Spencer Foundation, among others. So she's coming with quite a big CV. So we're really thrilled to have you here to speak about an issue that continues to be of deep importance here in Philadelphia and around our country, educational inequality, and you can speak about the history of that at Philadelphia's Germantown High School. I invite everybody to join me tonight in welcoming Erika Kitzmiller to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia.
This is so fun. This is my first in-person event, so I'm just so thrilled to be back in Philadelphia. I've just had a wonderful day. I came down early on the train, and it's just so wonderful to see all of you. So I'm going to orient everybody to Germantown. I'm also going to have some blank slides in here, so don't be startled when you just see a black screen. I think brain breaks are a good thing with PowerPoint, so when you see those, don't be like, the PowerPoint's broken. I just am a big believer that too many images and too much coming at us, particularly in a pandemic, is just too much. So as many of you know, because you live in Philadelphia, I always say to outsiders that Philadelphia looks a little bit like New Jersey. I tell my students in New York that all the time. And at the turn of the 20th century, Germantown, a community in Philadelphia's northwest corner, was home to a diverse group of individuals, but mainly white, wealthy residents who preferred the city's suburban periphery to its inner core. While Germantown's bourgeois residents beamed with pride about their isolated community, they were deeply concerned about their children, particularly their native-born white daughters traveling to and from the city's limited set of high schools located in its inner core. Beginning in 1907, Germantown residents waged a successful 7-year campaign to build a majestic neighborhood high school tucked neatly away in their quaint, secluded community. When Germantown High School opened in 1915, the school offered a first-rate academic education with coursework in Latin, Greek, botany, and rhetoric. Students were taught by teachers who were experts in their field, such as Dr. Anna Mulliken, the first woman to receive a doctorate in mathematics from the University of Pennsylvania. And after graduation, Germantown students enrolled in the nation's leading colleges and universities. Young men, like Forrest Brannard, attended colleges such as Harvard, Princeton, and Haverford, while young women like Alice Craigmile attended schools such as Radcliffe, Wellesley, and Smith. Eventually, many Germantown graduates assumed roles as leading civic leaders in Philadelphia's business and civic life. At the turn of the 20th century, Germantown High School was regarded as one of the leading secondary schools in the nation. Residents believed that it provided its graduates with a first-rate academic education and the necessary credentials to secure a prosperous future. Almost a century later, as many of you know, newspaper headlines featured Germantown High School once again. However, unlike earlier coverage that had celebrated the school's academic program, this news signaled its demise. On December 13, 2012, William Haidt, the superintendent of the School District of Philadelphia, announced that Germantown High School was one of 37 public schools slated for closure due to enrollment decreases, supposed low achievement, and district-wide fiscal crisis. According to Haidt's report, the school district's crisis stemmed from decades of flight from the public school system, district mismanagement, and inadequate public aid. In response, Philadelphians took to the streets to denounce state officials who had slashed millions in educational aid. Principals begged their families to donate hundreds of dollars to make up for these funding losses, and families did what they could. They opened their checkbooks and their wallets and donated their money to guarantee that their children's public schools had basic essential resources. The reliance on private philanthropy bolstered budgets in the city's most affluent public schools that served the city's most advantaged children. Principals in the city's poorest public schools had to find a way to cope with grossly inadequate public aid. For months, Germantown High School administrators, teachers, and alums collaborated with elected officials and community members to find a way to keep their nearly 100-year-old neighborhood high school open. They hosted rallies, attended community-wide discussions, and proposed alternatives. But school officials eventually voted to close the school. On June 21st, 2013, Germantown teachers packed their classrooms, moved their belongings, and shut the doors to Germantown High School. The Roots of Educational Inequality explores the political, economic, and social factors that transformed American high schools and contributed to the broader escalation of social inequality in America over the past 100 years. This book deepens our understanding of urban school inequality by pushing the story further back into the past to show how the interactions of class, race, gender, and resources and space help account for the ways that demographic change, white flight, and white resistance transformed the American high school, and in this case, ultimately led to closing of Germantown High. Despite the wealth of scholarship on urban communities and schools, this is the first book to trace the history of one high school in the context of its community and city over the course of the 20th century, deploying a longitudinal analysis that investigates daily events rather than key turning points. While this approach required many hard choices about what to include, as a teacher, researcher, and educational advocate, I felt that telling the story in this manner was the only way I could do justice to the long arc of injustice, inequity, and resistance in our nation's public schools and communities. The approach shows that Germantown High School's 21st century crisis stemmed from choices that school leaders made over the course of the school's 100-year history, beginning, of course, with its founding. The challenges of racial segregation, fiscal instability, and philanthropic subsidies are not the simple byproducts of post-war white flight, failed desegregation, and neoliberal reforms. These structural shortcomings have existed since American public schools were founded at the turn of the 20th century. There were always alternatives, other paths that we might have taken, and as this book shows, sometimes individuals took those paths, and sometimes they did not. While the Roots of Educational Inequality acknowledges the role of post-war residential and economic flight, it insists that public schools never had sufficient public resources to operate effectively. Rather than raise taxes to the levels required to fund the city schools, urban school districts, such as Philadelphia, Detroit, and Cleveland, instead relied on philanthropy to subsidize inadequate government aid. While this philanthropy provided essential supports to urban public schools, the dependency on private funds generated spatial and racial inequalities based on race and class, and often masked the inability of urban school districts to fund their schools with public revenues. This masking, of course, was much more likely to occur in bourgeois white communities, such as Germantown's early 20th century community, where upper and middle class residents could afford to supplement inadequate public school budgets with their own private funds. While many scholars have examined the connections between philanthropy and education, none of these scholars illustrate how local philanthropy historically created what I call doubly advantaged schools. Doubly advantaged schools served more white and more affluent students, and thus could leverage and rely on private philanthropy to subsidize inadequate public aid because the families that sent their children to these schools simply had more social and financial capital to give. As this book shows, the location of these doubly advantaged schools changed as the city's spatial patterns of race and class changed over time. At the turn of the 20th century, Germantown High School was a doubly advantaged school, but at the turn of the 21st century, it was not. While other cities, including Cleveland, Detroit, and St. Louis, relied on philanthropy to subsidize inadequate public school funding in the early 20th century, I would argue that Philadelphia is an ideal place to study the ways in which class, race, resources, and space work together to sustain and transform the public school landscape. When Philadelphia expanded its system of public high schools in the early 20th centuries, critics argued that the city was poised to have the finest system in the nation. But only a year after Germantown High School opened, Philadelphia School Board argued that the city lacked the financial resources to fund its schools adequately, and instead had to rely on philanthropy to make up material assistance that they could not rely on with public budgets alone. Today, as this report from the U.S. Commission of Civil Rights shows, and as today's closing arguments in the state funding court case, shows the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania has some of the nation's most inequitably funded public schools. High poverty, majority black school districts such as Philadelphia often spend about 30% less per pupil than more affluent majority white school districts. The school district of Philadelphia, which serves the largest number of black, Latinx, and poor youth in the state, spends approximately $13,000 per pupil each year. Lower Merion School District, just across city line, in one of the state's most affluent majority white suburbs, spends about $23,000 per pupil. Just pause there for a moment. In the 21st century, inadequate public school funding still disproportionately harms schools, educators, families, and youth that serve the nation's most vulnerable kids. When the School District of Philadelphia expanded its system of high schools at the turn of the 20th century, school officials allowed black and white youth to enroll in Germantown High School. Germantown High School has always been an integrated high school. But while the school was far from completely integrated, the fact that school officials never legally segregated black and white youth into separate schools allows one to examine the ways that race and racism shaped student access to the high school from its founding. And we can see this in this picture of a Philadelphia high school class where black and white students are learning side by side. Furthermore, I argue that because Germantown is a comprehensive neighborhood high school, it allowed me to study an institution that, at least in theory, was open to everyone who lived in the neighborhood. The high school opened in the first wave of the 20th century high school expansion, a time when many individuals hoped that Americans' public schools would serve as engines of democracy. But as my analysis shows, however, only a small percentage of urban youth actually graduated from high school, and the vast majority of those who graduated were upper class and white. This finding challenges the very notion that urban public schools served a democratizing function by offering opportunities to all American youth. The expansion of high schools at the turn of the 20th century democratized attendance. Many more youth had access to schools, but they did not necessarily graduate. Finally, I would argue that Germantown is an ideal site to study this history because its residents, as many of you may know, have a deep appreciation and reverence for local history, like most Philadelphians. Germantown teachers, alums, and activists have preserved many archival sources, such as high school yearbooks and student newspapers, that were so critical to my work. And as an ethnographer first and a historian second, I developed close relationships with these individuals. They willingly opened their school storage areas, musty basements, humid attics, to share these sources with me. And the oral histories that I did with Germantown youth, alums, and activists enhanced the archival sources tremendously. This diverse source base made it possible to tell the school story from the inside, a point of view that is rarely documented in historical research on urban public schools. Most scholarship links the demise of urban schools to post-war white racism and resistance, to any policy that threatened to strip away the economic, educational, and social advantages of white middle-class families and their youth. Historians have documented the ways in which white middle-class families refuse to integrate their neighborhoods, factories, and schools. And this newspaper article clipping is about a Black family that was trying to enroll their child in the closest school to their home. That school happened to be an all-white school in Germantown, and this Black family in 1926 was barred from attending that school. His son was sent down the street to the all-Black school, so he walked past the all-white school every morning, and he had to go to the all-Black school. The principal said that the all-white school was simply too crowded. But as this history shows, this history often focuses on the post-war period. So one of the things I'm trying to argue is that if we look further back, we can actually see the roots of this inequality in the foundation of our schools. We don't have to wait until white flight starts to occur. And when we do that, when we only focus on the post-war period, I argue it downplays the importance of early 20th century in setting the foundation for these racist practices. In addition, it obscures the role that urban school finances played in creating, maintaining, and promoting educational inequality. In contrast, this book illustrates the ways that white residents blocked proposals to build affordable integrated public housing units, to end discriminatory labor practices, and to integrate urban public schools beginning far earlier in the century. It also illustrates how the structures and spatial distribution of urban school finances have created significant resource disparities between white and Black schools since the beginning of the 20th century. This system has generated unequal access to educational resources along the lines of race and class, and since the 1920s has proven to be impervious to educational reforms that would equalize opportunities for low-income youth of color, mainly because none of these reforms address the inequitable structures of urban school finance. The book focuses on three central themes: the social organization of education and the construction of urban and metropolitan space, the political economy of urban education, and the failures of educational policy. The first theme illustrates how the American metropolis shaped and was shaped by its system of public schools. Since the founding of Germantown High School in 1915, school officials have supported an unequal system of public schools that has privileged white and middle-class communities and disadvantaged Black and low-income communities. The policies and decisions that officials made about school construction, catchment areas, and resource allocations have intensified racial segregation and educational inequality. Often these policies correspond neatly with existing patterns of race and class-based segregation in the metropolis and its schools. For example, as this map shows, school district policies and practices reinforce intensified patterns of class and race-based segregation. In the early 20th century, Philadelphia school officials caved to white resident demands to build new modern high schools such as Germantown High on the city's periphery to retain and attract white middle-class families to the city's bourgeois enclaves. So as you can see in this map, most of the new schools that were built in the city between 1905 and 1920 were in majority white communities. This really matters because the policies privilege children of upper and middle-class white families who moved from the city center to its periphery and then out to its racially segregated suburbs. School officials played an active role in creating policies and practices that intensified inequality. Throughout its history, Philadelphia school officials have maintained and often promoted separate and unequal access of public schools. One system that serves poor Black students and another that serves upper and middle class white students. In the beginning of the 20th century, school officials preserved these two systems through gerrymandered school boundaries, racially biased hiring practices, and forced transfers. This is an image of a school on 16th and Wharton where a child is sitting between two boards because there's not enough money for desks. This school served predominantly immigrant white children who lived in the center city at the turn of the 20th century. It's from 1907. In the late 20th and early 21st century, school officials sustained this two-tier system through market-based reforms aimed at expanding school choice and rising academic achievement. The reforms forced the closure of dozens of public schools and left thousands of low-income youth of color in under-resourced public schools such as Germantown. Meanwhile, white families have used their social and financial resources to raise hundreds of thousands of dollars to support their children's public schools. Philadelphia's system of public schools has always been separate and unequal. The book's second theme centers on the political economy of urban education. In this book, political economy refers to the ways that public policy and government regulation shape the economic, political, and social welfare of American youth. This happened in at least two ways. First, the policy decisions that government and school officials made about the school construction, curricular programs, and resource allocations influenced the reputation of individual high schools. High schools with newer buildings, academic programs, and higher per pupil expenditures were perceived as better, more desirable institutions. And as the racial demographics of Philadelphia's public schools shifted and white middle-class families moved first from the city's periphery and then to its suburbs, the reputation of Philadelphia's public schools also shifted. As schools became more bourgeois and white, the schools' reputations improved, and as schools became more poor Black and Latinx students, their reputations declined. In other words, the reputation of the school often corresponded with the class and racial compositions of the students inside the building, not what was actually happening inside the building. In the past and today, upper and middle class families who had the financial and social capital to exercise choice on the educational marketplace moved their families to the communities with the city's most reputable schools. These decisions ultimately affected the racial composition and eventually the intensification of segregation in Philadelphia's public schools. This chain reaction, district-level policies, demographic shifts, and individual choices shaped the reputation of Philadelphia's public schools and the demographics of the students who attended them. Taken together, these factors also shape the value of a high school credential. Even though every high school offered the same credential, right? It offered a high school diploma, these educational credentials had vastly different values in the educational and labor marketplace. The value corresponded to two things. First, it corresponded to the high school's reputation. Credentials from more reputable, academically oriented, and better resourced, predominantly white middle-class schools had a higher value on the marketplace than those from less reputable, vocationally oriented, and poorly resourced Black and low-income schools. For example, a diploma from the elite Central High School, shown here in this image, or a girls' high school, had a higher market value in the labor market than a credential from a high school located in a Black and low-income community, such as Simon Gratz or Benjamin Franklin. And I have oral histories to discuss this in the book. This was because school district officials implemented different curricular programs in these schools. As the residential demographics of the neighborhood shifted, the curricular programs changed. So we can see an image of here of a vocational program at a Philadelphia high school in the 1940s. Underfunded and ill-conceived vocational programs replaced prestigious and important academic programs as neighborhood schools moved from predominantly white and middle-class schools to predominantly Black and low-income schools, beginning in the late 1930s and early 1940s. These curricular shifts and educational disinvestment, which were intimately tied to race and class, weakened the reputation and in turn the value of the credential from high schools that served majority of Philadelphia's poor youth of color. Second, the credential's value often corresponded to students' race once they graduated. This was due in part to the racial discrimination that students experienced in high school and then eventually on the labor market. Evidence demonstrates that Black youth, even those who graduated from Germantown High School with an academic diploma, faced intense racial discrimination inside their high schools and in the labor market that barred them from many of the economic opportunities that their white peers enjoyed. Germantown faculty routinely tried to dissuade Black youth from enrolling in the school's academic programs and often encouraged them to select its commercial or vocational programs. Hundreds of Black youth, including Adrian Morrison, who's the third student in the back row from the left, defied this advice. This work shows that they often, even if they earned an academic diploma, they often still had to settle for unskilled or service jobs due to racial discrimination in the city's labor market, particularly in the early 20th century. Adrienne Morrison did not have to settle for that. She went to Bryn Mawr, and then she went to Temple, and she was one of the first Black social workers in the city working at the University of Pennsylvania hospitals. And she credits her family and her guidance counselor at Germantown High School for paving that way, so I just want to acknowledge that. School district policies, internal school practices, and labor market discrimination created a stratified educational credentialing market, a market that ascribes a higher value for credential earned by Philadelphia's white and upper middle class youth, and a lesser value for credentials earned by the city's Black and working class youth. So they all might have had high school diplomas, but the way that those were read on the marketplace varied. In addition to the ways that the credentials both afforded and constrained opportunity and mobility, school funding practices and policies, which is what my book really focuses on, also influenced the political economy of urban education. Scholarship that attributes the demise of urban education to a decline in school funding argues that there was this supposed golden age of education at the turn of the 20th century, when public school officials and civic leaders willingly used public dollars to fully fund urban public schools. According to these scholars, as white flight occurred, the tax revenues that once supported a robust system of urban public schools simply vanished. This book directly challenges this view. It argues that state and city officials never funded urban public schools adequately, and since the beginning of the 20th century, urban school districts have lacked the tax revenues needed to operate their schools. Rather than raise taxes, urban school districts, such as those in Philadelphia, Detroit, and Cleveland, instead relied on private philanthropy to subsidize inadequate government aid. This is the Mothers Association donation card at Germantown High School. The mothers raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for the school in the early 1920s and 1930s. It wasn't just bake sales, as I like to say. The dependence on philanthropy intensified educational inequality between and inside city schools. Upper and middle class white families, such as those in Germantown, supported their children's schools through private philanthropic efforts. Schools in these communities, just like today, are able to offer a first-rate education because upper and middle class white families supplemented grossly inadequate public budgets with their own funds. School administrators use these funds to purchase textbooks, modernize classrooms, and support extracurricular programs. These philanthropic efforts extended beyond the schoolhouse. Bourgeois families also donated time and money to a dense network of recreational clubs, philanthropic organizations, and social service agencies that provided an array of privately funded health and recreational activities outside of school in middle-class neighborhoods, and I will show you some. Philadelphia had a range of public school playgrounds for kids that were more often found in white communities than black, so to think about the racialized policies of the city. This is a bunch of kids crowded at the Commercial Museum. So the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Commercial Museum, and a bunch of other museums subsidize teachers and educational opportunities for kids. And this is the all-black Wissahickon Boys Club, which is still in operation in Germantown. So just to give you a sense of how this worked. But the spatial patternings of race and class, first by neighborhoods within the city and then between the city and its surrounding suburbs, benefited white upper and middle class youth by giving them access to educational and recreational activities that were largely unavailable to poor and black youth, because their families lived in different neighborhoods and lacked the private resources to compensate for shortfalls in urban school budgets. This reliance on philanthropy generated significant funding differentials between schools in affluent white communities and schools in black communities, which exacerbated racial and class-based educational inequality. These differentials created what I call doubly advantaged schools like Germantown at the turn of the 20th century, and as this book shows, like other schools in Philadelphia City District at the turn of the 21st century. So looking across, you can see how it moves from the periphery to the center with gentrification. Doubly advantaged schools had more private funding because they served wealthier youth. And furthermore, the over-reliance on philanthropy masked the school's inability to fund its schools, a reality that has become painfully clear to everyone at the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century as the world continues to weather the 2008 recession and the COVID-19 pandemic. This book demonstrates that money indeed does matter for schools. It matters for teachers, it matters for families, and it matters for kids, and it matters for communities. Money has always, from the founding of time, provided upper middle class and white youth with educational and social opportunities and advantages that poor Black and Latinx do not always have access to. The history in this book also forces us to grapple with the fact that the boundary between public and private in education and other social welfare programs is actually quite porous, and maybe perhaps more porous than most scholars recognize. Private funding of public schools by families, foundations, and communities is not a 21st century phenomenon. Rather, the practice and dependency on philanthropy to fund American public schools has a long and storied history. And this book shows that better state funding, which folks are arguing for today, has not and will not alone equalize resources among schools, not even among those within the same school district. That is because families in different neighborhoods do not have the same capacity to leverage private resources to benefit their children. Wealthy families have more social and financial capital, and thus they can donate more money, more resources, and more time to their kids' public schools. Finally, the book focuses on the failures of educational policy to translate ideas and recommendations into school reforms that might create more just and equitable educations for all youth. For decades, educational reformers have tried to put policies in place to match high school curricula to labor market needs and students' vocational aims. And as this book illustrates, Germantown High School, at least initially, was immune from these reforms, because it was largely a white upper middle class institution with a mission to prepare its graduates for post-secondary schooling and its futures as middle class professionals and wives. Despite this mission, Germantown faculty routinely barred Black youth from the school's academic programs and instead encouraged them to enroll in the school's commercial programs. But as I said earlier, for decades, Black youth refused to comply with the racist policies and practices inside their public school. From 1920 to 1950, contrary to conventional wisdom, most Black graduates enrolled in Germantown's academic program. The Black youth who graduated from Germantown High School in the first half of the 20th century understood the racial discrimination that their families faced in the labor market, and they knew that one avenue for social mobility was an academic diploma. And thus, if they attended Germantown High School, they fought to obtain an academic degree, to avoid manual work, and to assume professional positions as Black doctors, lawyers, and teachers, which so many people did. Through an analysis that weaves together the social organization of education and the construction of urban metropolitan urban space, the political economy of urban education, and the failures of educational policy, this book demonstrates how the convergence of class, race, and space generated a system of unequal access to educational resources and reinforced a system of racial and economic segregation. The story of Germantown High School forces us, as scholars, educators, and activists, to reckon with the fact that urban schools have remained largely impervious to educational reforms, including those that focus on vocational education, school desegregation, and school choice, because none of these reforms address the structural unequal distribution of race, space, and resources, both public and private, that have left low-income and youth of color in underfunded and under-resourced public schools since the turn of the 20th century. This project leverages an interdisciplinary approach to scholarship that uses an array of quantitative and qualitative methodologies from education, history, and sociology, and a diverse archival and contemporary source base. As Brandon Miller knows in the back row, I examined dozens, if not hundreds, of high school yearbooks with Germantown High School students that Brandon helped me get. And I gathered these data from school yearbooks. We wrote down the students who graduated from Germantown High School and their street addresses. And then I looked up thousands of names on the census. So if you look here, here's Raleigh right here. Here's her dad, Morris. So what I did is I made a database of the head of household occupation, the race of every graduate, and their gender, and also if they were an immigrant or not. And Raleigh is. Her father was born in Russia. Her dad was a clothing manager here in Philadelphia. I also used GIS mapping to plot where these graduates lived. And I did this for Central Girls High, Germantown, Gratz, and Olney, to think about the ways in which families had choices within Northwest Philadelphia. Where would their kids go? These maps show the 1940 Black graduates. As you can see on the top map, most of the graduates live within walking distance to their high school. And when Germantown High School was built, those kids lived within walking distance, most of the Black graduates and the white graduates, because families didn't have to pay for trolley fares. Some families were willing to pay for trolley fares to send their kids to Central and the Philadelphia High School for girls, but far fewer. When Central moved up to the Olney neighborhood, it was devastating for Black and immigrant families who lived in Center City, because then they had to pay trolley fare to get their kids up to that school. Same thing for Girls High. Initially, Central and Girls High were located in the center of the city. And so in 1920, Central High School had more Black and immigrant graduates than Germantown High School. Girls High School had more Black graduates than Germantown High School, largely because if you went to Girls High, you could go automatically into the normal school and become a teacher in Philadelphia segregated schools. So again, thinking about where schools are and how kids have access to them, I had to do the number crunching multiple times on that 1920 data, thinking about Central today and thinking about the fact that it served a majority Black and majority immigrant population in 1920 is still something that makes me really proud that I found that number. So, because that shatters what we think about exam schools and special admit schools today, particularly in New York City, where there are only 8 Black students in Stuyvesant High School. I also use qualitative methods examining city and community newspapers all over the city of Philadelphia, such as the Germantown and Chestnut Hill Improvement Association meeting notes. I use political scrapbooks and the Philadelphia Board of Education annual reports, which are available at the Free Library. These sources let me connect the political, economic, and social forces that shape the history of the school and its community to larger historical changes in the nation and city. I also use school newspapers, which were in the back room, Germantown High School's library, yearbooks and newsletters to document historical changes inside the school and to understand the perspectives that youth brought to these changes. That was really important to me, to make sure that I was thinking about how students were experiencing the school as much as I could. I also interviewed a whole bunch of people, and I'm still interviewing Germantown educators and alums who are willing to let me interview them about their experience in the high school. I filmed these oral history interviews with some Germantown High School students, and I conducted participant observations at the school events and rallies. The interviews and observations allowed me to analyze how the school district's decisions affected the lives of adolescent youth and how the intersections of class, race, and gender shape the lives of them inside the schools. The Roots of Educational Inequality shows how class, gender, race, and space have intersected with the political economy of urban education to create unequally resourced schools within one urban school district here in Philadelphia. The book argues that our high schools are not actually broken, but they're actually operating as they were designed to. These institutions were founded to provide different opportunities and resources to Black and white children, to rich and poor children. And these differences can be traced to the fiscal policies that existed at the turn of the 20th century and still do today. We can only see that by examining the history of one institution from its founding to its closure, and this is the first book to do that. This book, which focuses on one city, one school district, and one high school, sheds light on the broader transformation of urban communities and schools across the United States, on the ways that this country has failed to provide Black and low-income schools with equal and adequate resources, and on the possible solutions to address their shortcomings in the hope of creating more equitable and just outcomes for youth. And I just want to acknowledge that today was the closing arguments for the school funding court case that is still ongoing Commonwealth. This is Mindy Noble, who taught at Germantown High School in the 1990s, holding up a sign in Harrisburg saying with fair funding, Germantown High School would still be open. Thank you. So I'm happy to take any questions. If you could just tell me your name, I would just love to know who you are. Yes.
Sure. Hi, Erika.
Hi. Hi, Steve. Hi. Hey, Steve. How are you? Yeah. Sorry. I'm going to grab my breath. Yes, Steve was my professor at Penn. Hi, Steve.
Here, I think your sort of approach is really novel.
Well, the Fells training helped, so.
Here, and but I have two things I wanted to ask. One puzzled me. I was thinking about asking, then I mentioned it. So, yeah, we need more fair funding. We need more funding. We need more funding. We need more funding. But I thought at one point you said, well, even with more funding, none of this would change. So I wonder about, okay, what's the story about needing more?
Yeah.
Number one.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second, in terms of sort of causality and all this,
Yeah.
you start with, like, case, whites don't want to send their kids to schools with blacks. Even today, and it's no surprise to me that it was even more 1910, 1950. And regardless of where it is, our world of, hey, that happens in Alabama, is the joke of the century here, happens here all the time. They don't want to do that, and unless you're going to have some kind of a system where you say, you have to stay here while we make changes, people respond and they bug out.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't the white flight, remember, as you pointed out, this all happened before the white flight. So white flight, I don't think was the cause, it was what people did. And sometimes, I'll just note, when we say it was a fiscal policy, it was this and this, we don't have any policies that really aren't majority based.
Right. So I would say with the first question, we need more public funding for public schools, but that alone will not equalize the disparities. So one of the things that I think is really important is that in the great city of New York, where I now live, there's a school in my neighborhood that gets $2 million a year in private donations. If you're a teacher in a public school and your school has $2 million in private donations, you can do a lot of things with that. So I think also one of the things to think about is we need to just acknowledge that's a reality. In Philadelphia, many schools in Center City get private dollars from their families, and I don't think it's going to stop, but I think there are ways to do it more equitably. When I was a teacher in Wayland, Massachusetts, we had a foundation that families donated loads of money to. But there was a stipulation in the town that if you donated, there were 3 elementary schools, one of which was in the wealthiest part of that town, and if you donated $1 to that elementary school, you had to match the dollars at the other 2. So like there's a way to get around some of these inequities. So I think that's part of it, right? So we can't just say it's the kids inside the building because that's just not true. If you have hundreds of thousands of extra dollars that you can do whatever you want with, you can do a lot of things. Most of the schools that have librarians today is because of private dollars. Most of the schools that have school nurses in Philadelphia, it's because of private dollars. In New York City, private dollars fund teachers' aides, librarians, arts programs, all kinds of things that every child deserves. So I think that that's where I want people to think. And I say that because I went to an under-resourced public school in the center of the state, in the Alabama part. It's not like Alabama, I've been to both places, they're very different places, but the thing that saved me was my extracurricular programs after school. My cello lessons, my voice lessons, my piano lessons, like those, and I think every child needs those to thrive and survive and be a joyful, playful child. I have that for my own children, and it's something that I really cherish. So I think that that's part of it. We just have to admit that that exists. I think, yeah, I mean, people are racist, right? And so part of what I want to acknowledge is that the movement to the suburbs is what historians often look at, but the movement to the periphery of the city was white flight too, right? So a lot of people were living in Center City. They were first-generation immigrants. Once they were second-generation immigrants, they went to West Philadelphia, they went to Germantown, and this is true also for Black migrants. Like, Black migrants came to Center City, they might have lived on South Street, then they go to West Philadelphia, they go, right? People are trying to better their lives. And I interviewed Gilbert Fuller, who went to Ben Franklin, and he said, I moved to Germantown to get the quality of life that I wanted my kids to have. He was moving for the same reason. He was moving for the high school, but when he was able to move, that's exactly when disinvestment from the city happened, because white people were moving. And so I think one of the tensions in the book too is to think about, right, there's two strands of thoughts around integration and desegregation. You can push for integrating schools, as many Black activists and their allies did, but also Black activists and allies push for equalizing schools. So saying, like, it's okay, if you want to segregate our schools because this is a racist society, just give us the same funding and get rid of the racist white teachers in our school. And so that's part of the story too, I think, is to think about those parallel paths. I don't think we're inherently ever gonna get rid of white supremacy. I mean, I would like to, and I'm working really hard to do that. But I think that the important thing is to also acknowledge that this movement, white flight is not just a post-war phenomenon. People move with their feet all the time if they have the opportunity to do so. And it's not just white people that do that. Black people also do that. Asian people do that. Latinx people do that. It's just that when they move, oftentimes, the resources are taken away, right? And so I think that that's something to just think about structurally. But following the money, it fails really helped. So thanks, Steve. Yes.
How did the blind voting, I want girls, how are special education schools affected?
Today, you mean? I mean, I think they definitely affect school choice, right? I mean, but I think it's different. For me, I feel like, I mean, I do research at Carver High School, so I'll just be upfront about that. I have a project at Carver. Carver's still a majority Black school. In New York City, that's not true for special admit schools. And so I don't know if I think special admit schools should exist, but they're part of the landscape, and I really wish that actually every school looked like Carver High School does inside and had all the resources that that school has.
Are you saying that you don't think special admission schools?
I don't know that I can say that because I'm not a person who actually, I don't do research on special admit schools. So I'm just saying, like, my argument is that we need to bring the resources up for the other schools. And there shouldn't be any reason why academic curriculum are only really at Masterman, Central, Girls High, and Carver. There's no reason, I mean, I don't know, Brandon and I were at Germantown together, and I think we could have had, if we had those resources at Germantown, our kids could have flown too, and they could have soared. So I just think that that's something to acknowledge. I'm not.
That's true, but if you talk about schools like Girard Academic Music Program, music and art schools, I think those, I don't know, I didn't do research on it, but I've been in, I brought musicians into those schools. It seems to me that there is diversity of school demographics.
Absolutely, but I mean, why should Girard be the only place that has a robust music and art program? Right, I think that like every school should have a music and art program. I haven't been in Girard ever, so I can't really comment on it.
The other thing is that in the 60s, into around 1970,
Right.
Philadelphia had the best music program in the whole United States. What happened?
I didn't even know that, so I mean, I'm not sure what happened is to it. Okay,
Paradigm of music programs for urban schools
okay,
in the country.
okay. I'm not sure, so I can't answer that, I'm sorry. I think there's a question over here. Yes, question.
Yes, I was just gonna add on to what you were saying about the special ed schools. Now, I didn't attend Germantown High School. I attended Bach,
Okay,
which actually closed the same year.
right, that's right. And now has a bar on top of it, right? Yeah, I think so, right? Okay.
Yes, but by the way, a couple of teachers that taught at Bach, well, one of them was my teacher next door to me, and they both attended Germantown High
Oh,
School.
interesting. That's cool.
And yes, they were both excellent teachers.
Yeah, I think that's what we forget is that
Yeah, they're retired now, but yes,
at Bach.
yes.
Yeah, I think we forget that. So I just want to say that, like, if they had the resources, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yes, but what I was going to say is like, just because I even noticed that when I was in high school myself about what she was saying about the special ed school, like I had noticed, okay, like, so if you went to Central Girls High or Masterman, or engineering or science or or something like that, it's like you're put on a pedestal. It's like, oh, okay, you was extremely smart.
Right.
But then when I went back, we want to see the same.
Right.
But I can tell you though, there was a lot of smart students out there.
Yeah, one of the things that came up last night, like just to showcase how this like works in practice, is like at Carver High School, and I'm not faulting the Philadelphia Tribune for doing this, but they come and they interview kids who are exemplary students at Carver High School. They never, newspapers never came to Germantown unless there was some sensational story that they could talk about. Like there was an amazing drumline program at Germantown High School that Elizabeth D'Alessandro, who was the music teacher there, ran on, right, Brandon, like bare bones budget. Like we're talking like Home Depot buckets and sticks, and the kids were unbelievable. And we constantly, the principals, Elizabeth, lots of people called newspapers and said, come and cover this drumline, they are amazing. And they just didn't come, right? And so like, again, to your point, special admit students are put on a pedestal and comprehensive neighborhood high schools are largely ignored unless there's something negative that can be featured. And so I think that's something for us to really reckon with in Philadelphia and other places too, in terms of how we're celebrating teachers, how we're celebrating families, how we're celebrating kids that are in our city doing remarkable things every day, but because they're not at Masterman Central or Girls High or ENS or Girard, they're not celebrated in the press.
Yes, and I also want to add too that, you know, every student at every high school have the same opportunity, same access. You know, okay, even if it's not a magnet high school,
Right.
you know, yes, because definitely where I went at Bach, you know, even though I and many of my peers did go on to college, but you can tell it really wasn't set up for us to go to college.
Right. Yeah, in terms of how many kids one guidance counselor had, or I mean, I remember Germantown teachers got a ream of paper for the entire year. Like, you could just start, I mean, there wasn't toilet paper in the bathroom. Like, I always joke at Barnard, like, well, I have toilet paper, so it's a good day. You know, like, because that was like not a reality at Germantown High School when I was there. And, you know, that sends messages to educators and families and kids if they walk into a building every day and those are the conditions people are learning in, or they have higher class sizes. That's just the reality in Philadelphia. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead. I'm going to take off my glasses too because they're like fogging up with this mask, but go ahead.
I strongly believe in public schools, went to public schools, taught in public schools for many years, and was in the state office of education in two states, Texas and Massachusetts. So let me start with Texas.
Okay.
They do a Robin Hood bill, which
Yeah.
equates the property taxes are what fund education, and then they're equalized across the state so that the high schools get pretty much the same amount of money. We have a special issue in that so many Hispanic kids are non-English, from non-English speaking homes, and teaching Shakespeare becomes much more difficult. It's not so much people teach your ratios, which Bill Gates just did millions on. It's the composition and the dynamic of the class and how you can work with the various students. Let me explain to Massachusetts, because I also, after graduate school, taught in Brookline, 12th grade, in Newton, a history course that was a 3-year course using only documents for students, and I was in Wayland when we were drafted, so I didn't get to finish the work in Wayland, but at the Department of Education in Massachusetts, I saw this white flag. Louise Day Hicks was in fighting against the busing that was
I had met with students, yeah.
However, the social act was so hard. They were very small, and they weren't quite the top of the class. It was not altogether. That being said, I also saw Massachusetts install kindergarten. The legislature voted in May. We had no spaces, no teachers, no curriculum, no plan. But in September, the schools opened for kindergarten. And I think that has borne tremendous fruit, because on the PISA scores, which is the performance of international student achievement, different from the NAEP, that is not how kids are doing in America in basic. Massachusetts would be number 6 in educational attainment if it were a country. So they are doing some very good things.
Right, but they also have like very high per pupil expenditures, yet still strong inequities between, like in New Bedford or the North Shore or Boston has.
I don't know, I think the social movement and the housing issues are so that we ought to think of what we can focus on right now to help those schools and those kids. And one of the things that you brought up, and I strongly agree, is the parent inspiration and involvement. I wish there were more of that. I have an unread thesis by no one except my second husband, who tried it briefly, but nobody ever read it. But it did emphasize the importance of the aspiration of parents. All of whom were on AFDC, a financial aid program, all of whom were white, so they would be prejudice. And with the help of a lot of statistics, we really found that this parent expectation and inspiration. The last thing I'd say is that this is a rare moment because we have new tools for learning. We could provide a physics class that could be equal with a great physics teacher by using the technology.
I don't know if my Barnard students would agree with that after being on Zoom for 2 years.
With those kids' needs as nearly as possible.
Yeah, I just think having a highly qualified teacher in every classroom is the most important thing. And I think that also, if I can just add that oftentimes, and I can say this as a parent of kids who are in private school in New York City, oftentimes schools are not welcoming to families and parents of diverse learners or diverse ideas or diverse perspectives. And so I think that schools also need to reckon with how are they greeting people. And I can say at Germantown High School when I was there, and I don't mean to keep pricking on Brandon, but we were like hanging out together. Michael Silverman was the principal, and he stood at the door every single morning and greeted every single child. That does not happen at my children's school. So I just want to say, like, there are ways in which families can feel included as part of that conversation. And one thing that I'm really pushing my students at Barnard and Columbia to think about is how that's also the school's responsibility and not always on the burden of the family.
Perhaps we could emulate some of the things that Edison or
Oh, I'm just saying, my kids go to private school, and I really wish their principal was standing at the door like Michael Silverman was to say good morning to my children, so. Yeah. I think there's also a question in the back, and then I'll take your question, sorry.
Hello, thanks so much. My name is Daniel Simmons. I'm
Hi, Daniel.
a public school teacher.
Where?
Science Leadership Academy.
Oh, okay, cool.
Which is a fascinatingly relevant building.
You can tell Chris I said hello when you see him tomorrow morning.
One half is Ben Franklin High School, which is an almost exclusively black vocational program with a dwindling initiative against all of the district's most difficult to teach students to sort of run into that building. And then at my building is a plurality white, is the beneficiary of a lot of political and financial capital from
Yeah.
families. I think about this a lot. There's glass walls across the building between the schools. But I think, when you describe schools as like somewhat imperfect, don't seem to align in a majoritarian way that did a better job.
Yeah, and I don't mean to say it's impossible. I mean, I am an optimist. Yeah, impervious. Yeah, no. And I just want to, like, even when I said it tonight, I was like, did I really write that? Because I am an optimist, and I am a public school advocate. I'm a public school graduate. I'm a first-generation college student. I am here today with all these credentials and everything that Beth said because of my family and my teachers and my school guidance counselor who called Wellesley College and said, what does this kid need to do if she wants to get in, right? At a public school that had no money. So I want to say that. I think we need to thank the Black Power movement for school breakfast and lunch programs because they're the only reason why we have them. The city of Philadelphia, as I always say, free and reduced lunch is the name of the game here. Every kid gets it. Should be way healthier than it is, but every child gets it. In my hometown, kids have to stand in a free and reduced lunch line to get the lunch line, right? And that really, like, when I learned that, I was pretty hot, to put it mildly. So I think that there were many gains that happened. I think that one of the things that I learned at Germantown High School, and I learned a lot of things, was that oftentimes the reforms that people put on teachers don't work for kids. And so I think one of the big takeaways is one of the teachers who worked at Germantown High School when I was there with Brennan in 2007 and then moving on to when the school closed in 2013, they said we needed more money without strings attached and we needed people in central office to listen to us about what we could do with our kids. And I think when that actually happened, magical things happened at Germantown High School, even when there wasn't a whole lot of money, like the small learning communities in the 1990s, which were put into place on shoestring budgets, that SLA is actually modeled after, right? The small school movement, those things really mattered for kids, and we could be doing that in every high school in Philadelphia. They're not without problems. If you want to know the problems, come to New York City. I can tell you all about them, but we could be doing that with the funding that we have, right? And so I think that it is not that it's impervious. We have Black history in Philadelphia public schools, thanks to Black activists, many of whom went to Germantown, walked out of their high school in 1967, and were brutally assaulted by the Philadelphia police at the school district headquarters. So again, I think that there are movements that have happened. It's Women's History Month. That's something that matters, right? I think all that matters, but I think that we oftentimes think reforms are gonna save the day, and what saves the day is an excellent teacher in a classroom with kids who are engaged in learning and play, joy, and hope, and optimism, and oftentimes those are totally counterintuitive to the reforms that we put in, like standardized tests and scripted curriculum that only go into the schools, lowest performing schools, while the highest performing schools get, right, project-based learning, beautiful building, just to think about what they get in terms of those kinds of things. So I think that's sort of what my argument is. Does that help a little? Okay, last question?
I'd like to say what happened with the music program when it was cut in Philadelphia schools. They had said that it should go to the settlement the children should have their music lessons at the settlement music school. Now, settlement music school is an after-school program, and the children could not get
Right.
accepted to the camp music school, and it fell by the wayside because the children couldn't get to the settlement music schools that are in Germantown and South Philadelphia, and it just fell apart. And it was deliberate because they weren't willing to fund the music program, the instrumental program especially, and the art program fell apart because that wasn't funded.
Right.
So, and then some private people took up, was teaching art in storefronts. And, but that was all after school programs.
Right.
And how much can you exhaust the children? Well, to be in school all day and then have programs after school till 6, 7 at night.
Well, I think if they're play-based and happy, you'd be surprised. I mean, the Wissahickon Boys Club was in operation at Germantown, still is today, and lots of people credit it with their families being able to work after. I'm just saying, if it's a community-based organization that is about kids just being together after school and isn't about, I don't know, rote memorization and that kind of stuff.
An instrumental program is not what it was before the cuts.
Okay. I don't know this history. I just know in 2013, the school district cut most music programs because of the budget crisis. And people are now driving around the city at multiple places instead of being at Germantown High School or other comprehensive schools, which is not great. So I think I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you to Erika Kitzmiller for a talk that has obviously generated a lot of thinking and a lot of questions for all of us. We're so glad that you came. I'm going to take her right to the back before anybody can come up here to talk to her. You can buy your books. Head House Books has copies of her books. Erika will be here to sign them, to answer any questions that you have. We're so grateful that all of you came. Remember, bring young people that you know on Saturday between 10 and 3 for our book fair to hear amazing authors give talks, attend workshops, buy books, immerse themselves in books, having a great time. So we look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. I'm just gonna grab my coat.